My husband forbade me from going to our beach house for 40 years, claiming it was always under renovation. After his death, the lawyer handed me the keys. "It's yours now," he said. I was going to sell it immediately, but something told me to see the place first. When I opened the door, I couldn't breathe. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I'm Crystal, and at 65 years old, I thought I knew everything about my husband Barry. 43 years of marriage teaches you a person's habits, their secrets, their fears. Or so I believed until the day Mr. Henderson, our family lawyer, placed a set of keys in my weathered hands. "The beach house is yours now," he said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "Barry left specific instructions that these keys should only be given to you after his passing." I stared at the silver keys, their weight surprisingly heavy in my palm. The beach house. For 40 years, Barry had forbidden me from going there. Every time I suggested a weekend getaway to our property in Monterey, he'd shake his head and mutter something about ongoing renovations. "It's not ready yet, Crystal," he'd say, avoiding my eyes. "Maybe next year." Next year never came. 40 years of next years. Now, sitting in my empty living room 3 weeks after Barry's funeral, I turned those keys over and over in my hands. My first instinct was to sell the property immediately. What use did I have for a beach house I'd never seen? The maintenance costs alone would eat into my modest widow's pension. But something nagged at me, a curiosity that had been dormant for decades suddenly awakening. Why had Barry kept me away for so long? What was he hiding? The drive to Monterey took 2 hours, winding through hills that Barry used to travel alone every few months. He'd tell me he was going to check on the renovation progress, sometimes staying overnight. I'd accepted it, trusted him. Barry had never given me reason not to. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a house under renovation. This was a fully maintained, beautiful coastal cottage with fresh paint, manicured gardens, and windows that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Wind chimes hung from the wraparound porch, creating a gentle melody that seemed oddly familiar. My hand shook as I approached the front door. The key slid in easily. As if it had been used recently, the lock clicked open, and I stepped inside. The air didn't smell stale or abandoned. Instead, it carried the faint scent of lavender and lemon oil. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on the entry table, though they were beginning to wilt. Someone had been here recently, very recently. I walked through the front hallway, my footsteps echoing on polished hardwood floors. The living room was decorated in soft blues and whites, exactly the color scheme I'd always dreamed of for a beach house. On the mantelpiece sat framed photographs, and as I moved closer, my heart nearly stopped. They were pictures of me. Not recent photos, but images from the 1980s, when I was in my 20s and 30s. Me laughing at our wedding reception, me in a yellow sundress I'd forgotten I ever owned, standing on what looked like this very beach. Me sleeping peacefully in a hospital bed, my head wrapped in a colorful scarf during my chemotherapy treatments. But I'd never been to this house before. I was certain of it. So how were there photographs of me here? Some in poses I didn't even remember being taken. I moved to the kitchen, where I found the refrigerator humming quietly. Inside, it was stocked with my favorite foods: raspberry yogurt, the expensive kind I only bought for special occasions, Earl Grey tea, fresh strawberries, and a half-eaten container of chocolate ice cream that had been my comfort food during difficult times. On the counter, I discovered a small calendar marked with dates. Today's date was circled in red ink, with "Crystal Arrives" written in Barry's familiar handwriting. My legs felt weak, and I had to grip the counter for support. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly when I would come here. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The master bedroom was decorated with our wedding quilt, the one my grandmother had made, and that we'd stored in our attic years ago. On the nightstand was a photograph of Barry and me on our honeymoon, both of us so young and full of hope, but it was the walk-in closet that truly left me speechless. Inside hung clothes that belonged to me, but not clothes from my current wardrobe. These were outfits I'd loved and lost over the years. A red dress I'd worn to Barry's company Christmas party in 1987, a blue sweater I thought I'd donated to charity, a pair of comfortable slippers I'd mourned when they finally wore out. How did Barry get these things? Some of these clothes I hadn't seen in decades. Some I was certain I'd thrown away myself. I sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a beach house. This was a shrine to our life together, filled with memories I thought were lost forever. But why? Why had Barry recreated pieces of our past in this secret place? A small music box on the dresser caught my attention. When I opened it, our wedding song began to play, and a tiny ballerina spun slowly inside. But this wasn't our original music box. That one had broken years ago when we moved apartments in the early 90s. This was identical, but somehow newer, as if Barry had searched until he found an exact replacement. As the sun began to set outside the bedroom window, casting golden light across the walls, I realized I was trembling, not from fear, but from a growing awareness that I was standing in the middle of something extraordinary, something that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband and our marriage. But I had barely scratched the surface. There were other rooms to explore, other secrets waiting to be discovered. And deep in my heart, I knew that what I'd found so far was only the beginning of Barry's carefully guarded secret. What else was hidden in this house that he'd kept from me for 40 years? I couldn't sleep that night. I'd driven home from the beach house in a daze, my mind reeling with questions that had no logical answers. How had Barry recreated pieces of our life that I thought were lost forever? Why had he forbidden me from seeing this place that was so clearly meant for me? The next morning, I called in sick to my part-time job at the library and drove back to Monterey. I had to understand what I'd stumbled into. This time, I explored more systematically, starting with the rooms I'd missed the day before. The guest bathroom contained every skincare product I'd ever mentioned wanting to try, all arranged neatly on glass shelves. The small den was filled with books I'd loved and lost over the years, first editions of novels I'd read until the pages fell apart. But it was when I opened the door to what I assumed was a storage closet that my world tilted completely off its axis. The room was larger than I'd expected, and every inch of wall space was lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat dozens upon dozens of wrapped presents, each one tagged with a small card bearing my name and a date. I approached the nearest shelf with shaking hands and read the first card. For Crystal, Christmas 1983. Below it, in Barry's handwriting, the necklace you admired in that shop window on 5th Street. I saw you looking at it when you thought I wasn't watching. I remembered that necklace. A delicate silver chain with a small sapphire pendant. We'd been window shopping during our first Christmas as a married couple, when money was tight, and we'd agreed to skip gifts that year. I'd paused at that jewelry store window for maybe 30 seconds, imagining what it would feel like to wear something so beautiful. But we'd walked on, and I'd never mentioned it. Yet here was a present, wrapped in faded Christmas paper, waiting for me to open it 40 years later. I moved to the next gift. For Crystal, your 35th birthday. The card continued. The art supplies you mentioned wanting when we watched that painting show together. I know you said we couldn't afford them, but I've been saving. My 35th birthday. I barely remembered mentioning art supplies, but Barry had listened. He'd remembered a casual comment about wanting to try watercolors, and he'd bought them for me. But I'd never received this gift. On my actual 35th birthday, Barry had given me a nice dinner at home and apologized for not having money for presents. We'd been saving for the down payment on our house that year. Present after present lined the shelves, each one representing a different year, a different occasion. Your 42nd birthday, the gardening tools you looked at in the catalog. Christmas 1997, the cookbook from that Italian restaurant you loved. Our 20th anniversary, a trip to Paris, like you mentioned in your sleep, a trip to Paris. I found the envelope and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 plane tickets dated 20 years ago, along with hotel reservations and a detailed itinerary written in Barry's careful handwriting. Places I'd dreamed of seeing, restaurants I'd mentioned wanting to try. He'd planned an entire European vacation for our anniversary, complete and ready to go, but we'd never taken that trip. That year, Barry's mother had fallen ill, and we'd spent our anniversary weekend at the hospital instead. I'd told him it didn't matter. That family came first. I'd meant it too. But Barry had already bought the tickets, already made the plans, and he'd never told me. I sank into a chair that Barry had placed in the center of the room, surrounded by decades of unopened gifts. Each present represented not just a material item, but a moment when Barry had seen me, really seen me, and noticed something I wanted or needed. Times when I thought he was distracted by work or life's pressures, he'd been watching, listening, planning. But why had he never given them to me? Why had he kept them here, in this secret room, letting me believe that he'd forgotten my birthdays, or that money was too tight for gifts? I picked up one of the larger boxes, dated from just 2 years ago. For Crystal, because you deserve beautiful things every day. Inside, I found a silk robe in my favorite shade of deep purple, along with matching slippers and a set of luxurious bath salts. The kind of indulgent gift I would have protested was too expensive, too frivolous. That's when it hit me. These weren't just gifts Barry had forgotten to give. These were gifts he'd known I would refuse, things I would have insisted we return because we couldn't afford them, or because they were too extravagant, or because someone else needed the money more. I'd spent our entire marriage being practical, sensible Crystal, the wife who clipped coupons and mended clothes and never bought herself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I'd taken pride in our frugality, in my ability to make every dollar stretch. But Barry had been here, in this secret room, buying me all the things I'd denied myself over the years. The weight of it overwhelmed me. 40 years of love, carefully selected and wrapped and stored away, waiting for a moment that never came. 40 years of Barry wanting to spoil me, to treat me like a queen, but knowing I would never let him. I found a box from our 15th anniversary and unwrapped it with shaking hands. Inside was a diamond tennis bracelet, the kind I'd admired in magazines but never dreamed of owning. The receipt was still there, $3,000, a fortune for us at that time. Barry had spent $3,000 on a bracelet I would have made him return immediately if he'd given it to me. But he'd wanted me to have it. He'd wanted me to feel precious, valued, adorned with beautiful things, and I would have robbed him of that joy, insisting it was too much, too impractical. Tears streamed down my face as I continued exploring the room. There were 43 presents in total, one for each year we'd been married. Some small and thoughtful, others breathtakingly generous. All of them chosen with a love so deep and patient that it took my breath away. Near the back of the room, I found something that made my heart stop completely. A shelf labeled "The Letters I Never Sent," filled with sealed envelopes, each one dated and addressed to me in Barry's familiar handwriting. I picked up the most recent one, dated just 6 months before his death. My hands shook as I opened it and began to read. My dearest Crystal, if you're reading this, then you've found our secret room. I know you must be confused, maybe even angry that I kept this from you, but I need you to understand why I did this, why I spent 40 years collecting these gifts instead of giving them to you when I wanted to. But as I read further, I realized this letter was only the beginning. There were dozens more, a lifetime of words Barry had wanted to say but never found the courage to speak aloud. And somewhere in this house, I was beginning to suspect there were more secrets waiting, more rooms I hadn't discovered yet, more pieces of Barry's heart that he'd hidden away, perhaps waiting for this exact moment when I would finally be ready to receive them. What else had my husband been planning all these years? I spent 3 days reading Barry's letters, each one revealing layers of a man I thought I knew completely. Letters filled with observations about my daily habits, my dreams, my fears. He'd noticed when I started putting honey in my tea instead of sugar. He'd written about the way I hummed while folding laundry, and how that simple sound made him fall in love with me all over again. But it was the letter dated from 15 years ago that stopped me cold. Crystal, I went to see Dr. Martinez today. The tests confirmed what I've been afraid to admit. Early onset dementia, probably Alzheimer's. I'm 55 years old, and already I can feel pieces of myself slipping away. I haven't told you yet because I can't bear to see the fear in your eyes. But I'm terrified, my love. Not of dying, but of forgetting. Of forgetting us. My hands trembled as I read on. I've decided to turn our beach house into something special. A place where I can store every memory, every moment, every reason I fell in love with you. If the day comes when I can't remember your name, maybe this house will help me remember your smile. 15 years. Barry had been battling dementia for 15 years, and I'd never known. All those times I thought he seemed distracted. When he'd repeat stories or forget small details, I'd attributed it to stress from work or normal aging. He'd hidden his decline so carefully, so completely, that I'd never suspected the truth. I needed to understand more. I needed to find where Barry had documented this journey he'd been taking without me. The search led me to the attic, accessible by a pull-down ladder I'd noticed but ignored during my previous visits. Climbing up into the dim space, I found it wasn't a typical attic filled with storage boxes and forgotten furniture. Instead, it was a carefully organized office space, complete with a desk, filing cabinets, and shelves lined with journals. Dozens of journals, all labeled with dates spanning the last 20 years. I opened the earliest one, dated 20 years ago, and Barry's familiar handwriting filled the pages. Crystal made blueberry pancakes this morning. She always adds an extra egg to make them fluffier, even though the recipe doesn't call for it. She doesn't know that I know this, but I've watched her cook for 23 years, and I notice everything about her. I'm writing this down because lately, I've been having trouble remembering small things. Yesterday, I couldn't recall the name of our first dog, Buster. His name was Buster. I don't want to forget Buster, or the way Crystal cried when we had to put him down. As I read through the journals chronologically, I watched Barry's handwriting slowly deteriorate, his sentences becoming shorter, his observations more fragmented. But his love for me never wavered. If anything, it grew more intense, more desperate, as if he was trying to capture every detail before it slipped away forever. Year 10 of the diagnosis. I forgot Crystal's middle name today. Marie. Her middle name is Marie, after her grandmother. I wrote it down 50 times tonight so I won't forget again. But I'm scared about what I'll forget tomorrow. Crystal asked me why I've been going to the beach house so often. I told her the gutters needed cleaning. The truth is, I go there to practice remembering her. I have photographs everywhere, labeled with details. This is Crystal at age 28, wearing the blue dress I bought her for Easter. This is Crystal laughing at my joke about the talking parrot. I quiz myself like a student studying for an exam. I can't remember what Crystal's mother looked like, but I can still remember the exact shade of green in Crystal's eyes when she's happy. Some memories hold on tighter than others. I pray the important ones stay the longest. The later journals revealed the true scope of Barry's secret project. He wasn't just collecting gifts and storing memories. He was creating a comprehensive backup system for our entire relationship, documenting every detail he could remember before his mind stole them away. I've been working with a contractor to modify the beach house. Sounds strange, but I'm having rooms built that recreate specific places where Crystal and I were happy. The bedroom from our first apartment, the kitchen from the house where we lived when she was sick. If I can't remember these places anymore, maybe being in physical recreations of them will help trigger the memories. Crystal mentioned today that she wishes we could afford to travel. She was looking at a magazine article about Italy. I'm going to have Giuseppe, the contractor, help me recreate that Italian restaurant where we had our first anniversary dinner. Every detail, down to the wine we drank and the song that was playing. Maybe someday, when I can't remember our real anniversary, I can take her there and we can make the memory again. I found building permits, receipts, detailed floor plans. Barry had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, money I'd never known we had, transforming the beach house into an elaborate memory palace. Room after room, designed to hold different pieces of our life together. But the most heartbreaking entries came from the final few years. I got lost driving home from the grocery store today. Crystal had to come find me. I told her I was just taking the scenic route, but the truth is I didn't recognize anything. The streets where I've lived for 30 years looked completely foreign. I'm running out of time. I can't remember Crystal's laugh anymore. I know she laughs. I see her lips move and her eyes crinkle, but the sound is gone from my memory. This is worse than forgetting facts or dates. This is forgetting the music of her. Doctor Martinez says I have maybe 2 more years before the decline becomes impossible to hide. 2 years to finish the house, to complete my gift to Crystal. 2 years to make sure that even if I forget how much I love her, she'll never forget how much she was loved. The final entry was dated just 1 month before Barry's death. I didn't recognize Crystal this morning. For about 10 minutes, she was a stranger making breakfast in my kitchen. Then she smiled, and something clicked back into place. She was my wife again, my beautiful wife. But I know it's getting worse. Soon, the moments of recognition will be shorter, and the stranger periods will last longer. I need to make sure the house is ready. I need to make sure Crystal finds it when I'm gone. She has to understand that even when I didn't know her name, my heart never forgot how to love her. I closed the journal and sat in the quiet attic, surrounded by 20 years of Barry's secret struggle. He'd faced the most terrifying diagnosis a person could receive, the gradual theft of his very self, and instead of surrendering to despair, he'd spent every remaining day of clarity building me a monument to our love. But there was still one room in the house I hadn't been able to access. A door on the first floor that was locked with a different key, one that wasn't on the ring Mr. Henderson had given me. According to Barry's journals, that room contained the centerpiece of his project, the final gift he'd spent years preparing. I needed to find that key. I needed to see what Barry had considered the most important part of his legacy to me. Because I was beginning to understand that this house wasn't just a collection of memories. It was Barry's way of ensuring that our love story would survive even the cruelest disease, even death itself. And if I knew my husband, the room I hadn't seen yet would be the most extraordinary part of all. The question was, where had he hidden the key to his final secret? The key wasn't in any obvious place. I'd searched through every drawer, every cabinet, every possible hiding spot I could think of. But then I remembered something from Barry's journals. He'd mentioned hiding important things in places that had meaning to us both. I went back to our bedroom and examined the music box more carefully. The tiny ballerina that had been spinning to our wedding song stopped when I lifted her gently from her post. Underneath, nestled in the velvet lining, was a small golden key. My heart pounded as I made my way downstairs to the locked door. This key was different from the others, older, more ornate, as if Barry had chosen something special for his most precious secret. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and I pushed open the door to what I'd assumed was just another bedroom. What I found instead took my breath away completely. I was standing in our first apartment. Not a replica, not a recreation, but somehow, impossibly, the exact space where Barry and I had lived as newlyweds 43 years ago. The same hideous orange carpet that we'd complained about but couldn't afford to replace. The same tiny kitchen with the refrigerator that hummed too loudly. Even the water stain on the ceiling from when the upstairs neighbor's bathtub had overflowed. Every detail was perfect, down to the books on our makeshift shelf made from boards and concrete blocks. The wedding gifts we'd been too poor to properly display. The second-hand furniture we'd bought piece by piece. But this wasn't just any recreation. These were our actual belongings from that time, somehow preserved and arranged exactly as they'd been decades ago. I picked up a coffee mug from the kitchen counter, one I remembered breaking during our move to our second apartment. But here it was, whole and perfect, sitting next to the morning crossword puzzle that Barry used to do while I got ready for work. On the kitchen table, I found a note in Barry's handwriting. "This is where we learned to be married. Where you burned dinner every Tuesday, but I ate it anyway because you tried so hard. Where we slow danced in the living room because we couldn't afford to go out. Where I first realized that being poor didn't matter as long as I had you." But this room was just the beginning. I walked through what should have been a doorway to the outside, but instead found myself in a completely different space, the kitchen of our second home, the little house where we'd lived when I was undergoing chemotherapy treatments. Here was the chair where Barry had sat with me during the long nights when I was too nauseous to sleep, the blender he'd used to make nutritious smoothies when solid food was impossible, the soft blanket he'd wrapped around my shoulders when the chills became unbearable. Another note waited on the counter. "This is where I learned what for better or worse, really meant. Where I watched you fight for your life with more courage than I knew existed. Where I fell in love with your strength, your humor even when you were scared, your determination to live. Where I promised myself that if you survived, I would spend every remaining day making you happy. Room after room opened before me, each one a perfect recreation of a different stage in our life together. The vacation rental in Cape Cod, where we'd celebrated my 5-year cancer remission. The hotel room where we'd stayed during Barry's father's funeral, where he'd cried in my arms and I'd seen him vulnerable for the first time. But it was the recreation of Giuseppe's Italian restaurant that nearly brought me to my knees. Barry had built an exact replica of the dining room where we'd celebrated our first anniversary. The same checkered tablecloths, the same dim lighting, even the same vinyl booth where we'd sat because it was the cheapest table in the restaurant. A bottle of Chianti sat on the table, the same wine we'd shared that night because it was the least expensive on the menu. Giuseppe's had closed down 15 years ago, but here it was, preserved in perfect detail. I could almost smell the garlic bread, almost hear the accordion music that had played softly in the background while Barry had shyly reached across the table to take my hand. A longer note waited here. Do you remember what you said to me that night? You said that even if we never had money for fancy restaurants or expensive vacations, you'd rather eat spaghetti with me than lobster with anyone else. I've thought about those words every day for 42 years. You made poverty feel like abundance because love was the only luxury we really needed. The final room was the most elaborate of all, a recreation of the hospital room where I'd given birth to our daughter Sarah, who'd lived for only 6 hours. Barry had recreated every detail: the uncomfortable hospital bed, the machines that had monitored her tiny heartbeat, even the view from the window that showed the parking lot where Barry had paced while waiting for news. This room hurt to see, but I understood why he'd included it. Sarah had been the deepest sorrow of our marriage, the child we'd lost and never been able to have again. For years after, we'd avoided talking about her, afraid that speaking her name would make the grief too raw to bear. But Barry's note here was different. This is where we learned that love doesn't always mean happy endings, where we held our daughter for the only hours we would ever have with her, where you were stronger than I was, holding her while I fell apart, where we discovered that some losses are so profound they become part of who you are forever, but also where we learned that grief shared is grief that doesn't destroy you. On the hospital bedside table, I found something that made me cry harder than I had since Barry's funeral. A tiny pink hospital bracelet with Sarah Hartwell printed in careful letters, and next to it, a small teddy bear that I'd never seen before. The bear had a note tied around its neck. For the daughter we never got to spoil, for the grandbabies who might have been, for the Christmas mornings that should have happened. I've loved her every day, even though I only held her once. I sat on the hospital bed, clutching Sarah's teddy bear, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Barry had created. This wasn't just a house, it was a living museum of our entire marriage, every joy and sorrow carefully preserved and honored. He'd spent 15 years working in secret while fighting a disease that was stealing his memories, to ensure that our love story would never be forgotten. Every room was a testament to a different lesson our marriage had taught him, a different way that love had shaped and changed him. But I still didn't understand the full scope of his plan. Why had he built this place? What was he hoping would happen when I found it? The answer, I realized, might be in the final thing I hadn't yet discovered. Whatever Barry had planned for me to do with this extraordinary gift. Because knowing my husband, even in death, he wasn't just giving me memories. He was giving me a choice about how to spend the rest of my life. And that choice, I suspected, would be the most important decision I'd ever have to make. I spent the night in the house, sleeping in the recreated bedroom from our first apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of who Barry and I used to be. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the same curtains we'd hung as newlyweds, and for a moment, I felt 22 again, hearing Barry humming in the kitchen as he made coffee. But Barry was gone, and I was 65 years old, trying to understand the gift he'd left behind. I found the final piece of his puzzle in the room I'd overlooked, a small study tucked behind the recreation of Giuseppe's restaurant. Inside, an antique writing desk sat beneath a window overlooking the ocean, and on its surface was a leather-bound journal I hadn't seen before. This one was different from the others. Instead of documenting his daily memories or his struggles with dementia, this journal was filled with letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me, all written during his final months when he knew his time was running out. I opened to the first page and began to read. My dearest Crystal, if you're reading this, then you've discovered our secret house and all the rooms I built for us. I hope you understand now why I kept this from you for so long. It wasn't because I didn't trust you or because I wanted to hurt you. It was because I needed time to finish it, to make it perfect, before I could no longer remember why it mattered. The letter continued. You're probably wondering what I expect you to do with this place. The truth is, I built it for both of us, but mostly for you. You see, I've been planning something for after I'm gone. Something that I hope will give the rest of your life the meaning and joy that I always wanted to provide but never quite knew how. My hands shook as I turned the page. I know you, Crystal. I know that after I die, you'll want to sell our house, get rid of my things, maybe move to some small apartment where you can live quietly and economically like you always have. You'll think that's what you should do, what's practical and sensible. But I'm hoping this house will change your mind about what the rest of your life could look like. I read on, my heart racing. I've left instructions with Mr. Henderson about the finances. You don't know this, but I've been investing carefully for decades, putting away every spare dollar in accounts you never knew existed. The beach house is paid for. The maintenance is covered by a trust fund that will last longer than you will. And there's more. Enough money to ensure that you never have to worry about being practical or sensible again. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. We'd never been as poor as I'd thought. Barry had been secretly building wealth while I clipped coupons and mended clothes and denied myself every small luxury. I know you're probably angry about the money, wondering why I let you sacrifice so much when we could have afforded more. The truth is, I tried to spoil you 1,000 times over the years. But you always insisted we save for emergencies, always put practicality before pleasure. So, I saved the money for the biggest emergency of all, my death and your life after it. I found detailed financial statements tucked into the journal. Barry had accumulated over $800,000 in various investment accounts, money I'd never known existed. Combined with his life insurance and the value of our properties, I was actually quite wealthy. But the money wasn't the real gift. The real gift was explained in his next letter. Crystal, I want you to live in this house. Not just visit it, but actually live here, surrounded by all the memories we created together. Each room is designed to help you remember not just our past, but who you really are underneath all the years of being sensible and practical. But more than that, I want you to invite other people to share this place with you. Do you remember Mrs. Patterson from down the street, whose husband died last year? And Janet from the library, who's been alone since her divorce? And Susan Martinez, Dr. Martinez's wife, who's been struggling since her children moved away? I did remember them. Women like me, widowed or alone, trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives after loss. I want you to invite them here, Crystal. Not for visits, but to live here with you. This house is big enough for several people, and there's enough money to support whoever needs a home. You could create a family of choice, women who understand loss and loneliness, who could help each other heal. The idea was extraordinary, and so typically Barry. He'd always been the one to invite the lonely neighbor for dinner, to offer help to anyone who needed it. Even in death, he was trying to take care of people. I know it sounds strange, maybe even impossible. But think about it, Crystal. You've spent 43 years taking care of me, putting my needs first, being the wife who made everything work. Now you have a chance to discover who you are when you're not trying to be anyone's caretaker. And maybe, surrounded by women who could become true friends, you'll finally let yourself be taken care of for once. I found more letters, each one outlining a different aspect of Barry's vision. He'd researched local organizations that helped widowed women, support groups for people dealing with loss, community centers that offered programs for seniors. He'd created a roadmap for how I could transform the beach house into something more than just a memorial. I could make it a healing place for others who needed what I needed. I've watched you your whole life, putting everyone else first, never asking for what you wanted, never believing you deserved beautiful things or extraordinary experiences. This house is my way of giving you permission to want more, to ask for more, to believe that you deserve a life full of joy and beauty and friendship. But it was his final letter that brought me to tears. Crystal, I know you think that your life is winding down, that the best parts are behind you now that I'm gone. But I need you to understand something. You're only 65 years old. If you're lucky, you have 20 or even 30 years ahead of you. 20 years is longer than the time we spent in our first 3 homes combined. It's long enough to have an entirely new life, new adventures, new relationships that could be just as meaningful as what we had together. I'm not asking you to forget me or stop loving me. I'm asking you to love yourself enough to embrace the possibility that there are still wonderful chapters in your story waiting to be written. And maybe if you fill this house with women who need healing and friendship, you'll discover that the most beautiful parts of your life are still ahead of you. The letter concluded with specific instructions. Barry had already contacted several women he thought might benefit from what he called the beach house family. He'd researched the legal requirements for creating a communal living arrangement. He'd even consulted with social workers about how to make it successful. Everything was planned, organized, ready to implement. All I had to do was decide whether I was brave enough to try something completely different at 65 years old. I sat at Barry's desk as the sun set over the ocean, surrounded by the evidence of his extraordinary love and his impossible dream. He'd spent the last 15 years of his life creating not just a memorial to our marriage, but a blueprint for my future happiness. The question was, did I have the courage to follow his plan? Could I really invite near strangers to share this sacred space? Could I transform from the woman who'd spent her life being practical and self-denying into someone who embraced joy and friendship and beautiful things? Looking around at the rooms Barry had built, each one a testament to his belief that love could overcome any obstacle, I realized that maybe courage wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about trusting that someone who had loved me so completely might actually know what I needed to be happy, even if I was too scared to know it myself. 6 months later, I woke up to the sound of laughter drifting through the windows of the beach house. Not the echo of memories, but real, present-day laughter from women who had become my family in ways I never could have imagined. Margaret Patterson was in the kitchen, teaching Elena Rodriguez how to make her famous blueberry scones. Elena had moved in 3 months ago, after her husband's sudden heart attack left her alone in a house too big and too full of ghosts. She was learning to laugh again, something I understood completely. Janet Murray sat on the front porch with her morning coffee, reading aloud from the newspaper to Ruth Chen, whose glaucoma had progressed to the point where she could no longer see clearly enough to read herself. Ruth had been Barry's final addition to our little family, a woman whose grown children lived across the country and visited twice a year with guilt-filled efficiency. And then there was Dorothy Williams, 72 years old and the most surprising addition of all. She'd shown up at our door 2 months ago with a suitcase and a story about her family selling her house out from under her to pay for her son's gambling debts. "I heard you ladies might have room for one more," she'd said with dignity that broke my heart. She'd been here ever since, proving that sometimes the best family members are the ones who choose you. I'd been terrified when I first reached out to these women, following Barry's carefully researched list. The conversations had been awkward, tentative. "I know this sounds strange," I'd said to each of them, "but I have this house and I think maybe we could help each other." But Barry had been right about who needed what. Each woman who'd joined our beach house family had been struggling with loneliness, with the particular isolation that comes when you're older, and everyone assumes your interesting life is behind you. "You mean we'd all live together? Like roommates?" Margaret had asked during our first meeting, her voice skeptical. "More like chosen family," I'd replied, using Barry's words. "Women who understand what it's like to start over when you thought you were finished starting." The transformation had been gradual but remarkable. Margaret, who'd been surviving on frozen dinners and grief since her husband's death, had rediscovered her love of cooking when she had appreciative people to feed. Elena had started painting again, turning the sunroom into an art studio where she created watercolors of the ocean that seemed to capture something hopeful in every brushstroke. Janet had begun writing again, working on the novel she'd abandoned 20 years ago when life got in the way. And Ruth, despite her failing vision, had become our unofficial therapist, the one we all sought out when we needed someone to listen without judgment. As for Dorothy, she'd surprised us all by revealing a talent for gardening that had transformed Barry's carefully maintained yard into something spectacular. "Plants don't care how old you are," she'd said, hands deep in the soil as she coaxed roses to bloom more brilliantly than they had in years. "They just want someone to pay attention to them." I'd worried that living with others would feel like an invasion of the sacred space Barry had created. Instead, I'd discovered that the house seemed to come alive with multiple people appreciating it. The recreated rooms weren't shrines anymore. They were starting points for new memories. Margaret and I had spent a wonderful evening in the recreation of Giuseppe's restaurant, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about our first marriages, comparing notes on what we'd learned about love over the decades. Elena often curled up in the recreation of our first apartment to read, saying the cozy space reminded her of her grandmother's house in Mexico. The gift room had become our communal space for celebrating birthdays and holidays. We'd started a tradition of opening one of Barry's carefully chosen presents together each month, marveling at his thoughtfulness while creating new rituals around his old gifts. But the most unexpected development was how the house had attracted others who needed what we'd found. Word had spread through the community about our experiment, as the local newspaper had called it. Women started stopping by for coffee, lingering for conversation, sometimes staying for dinner. Dr. Martinez's wife, Susan, had become a regular visitor, helping us navigate the social services that could benefit other women in similar situations. We'd started an informal support group that met monthly, sharing resources and strategies for rebuilding life after loss. "You've created something special here," Susan had told me just last week. "Barry would be so proud of what you've built from his gift. Barry would be proud." I felt his presence everywhere in the house, not as a sad ghost clinging to the past, but as a benevolent spirit celebrating the new life that had grown from his carefully planted seeds. I'd found a way to honor his memory while embracing the future he'd envisioned for me. The woman who'd spent decades denying herself simple pleasures now enjoyed fresh flowers in every room, good wine with dinner, and the luxury of interesting conversation with women who'd become true friends. The financial freedom Barry had secretly provided meant none of us worried about grocery bills or utility costs. Instead, we worried about more pleasant things: which movie to watch together on Friday nights, whether to plant tomatoes or herbs in the new garden beds, how to convince Ruth to let us throw her a proper birthday party. This morning, as I sat in Barry's office writing thank you notes to local organizations that had helped us connect with other women who needed support, I realized that I was truly happy for the first time since his death. Not the desperate happiness of denial or the determined happiness of someone forcing herself to move on, but the deep, satisfied happiness of a life being well lived. I'd kept every one of Barry's letters, and I reread them often, marveling at how well he'd known me, how clearly he'd seen what I needed even when I couldn't see it myself. His final gift hadn't just been the house or the money or even the carefully preserved memories. His gift had been the vision of who I could become if I stopped limiting myself to who I thought I should be. At 65, I'd discovered that I could be a woman who wore beautiful clothes just because they made me feel good. A woman who bought expensive skincare products and didn't feel guilty about the cost. A woman who could open her home and her heart to near strangers and find they became the sisters she'd never had. The beach house had become exactly what Barry had dreamed it could be, a place where love multiplied instead of diminished, where memories of the past nourished hopes for the future, where women who thought their stories were ending discovered they were really just beginning a new chapter. That evening, as our household gathered for dinner around the table Barry had placed in the recreation of our second home's dining room, I raised my glass of wine. Good wine, the kind I would never have bought for myself a year ago. To Barry, I said, as I did every evening, who knew that the best way to say goodbye was to teach us how to say hello? The women around the table raised their glasses, these remarkable friends who'd become my chosen family. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and inside, the house that love built continued to work its quiet magic, proving that some gifts are so powerful they can transform not just one life, but many. Barry had been right about everything. I'd had 20 or 30 good years ahead of me, but more importantly, he'd been right that I deserved to fill those years with joy, friendship, and the kind of love that multiplies when it's shared. The house would stand for generations, a testament to what's possible when someone loves you enough to see your potential even when you can't see it yourself. And every woman who found refuge within its walls would carry that lesson forward, learning to love herself enough to embrace the beautiful, surprising possibilities that life offers to those brave enough to say yes, even at 65, even after loss. Even when you think your story is over, love has a way of proving that the best chapters might still be waiting to be written. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.